Welcome, everybody. I'm standing in for Catherine today, who I think will be with us shortly. We are delighted to have Greg Acs, who is going to talk to us about measuring mobility, which I'm very much looking forward to. So take it away.
Sure. Thank you, Jeff, and thank you all for inviting me out or inviting me to speak to you about our work on developing individual and community level metrics to measure mobility from poverty. I really would have loved to be in Madison today. I have my Bucky Badger here just to be part of the group.
All right.
Yeah, my son let me steal it from his room. So let me...
the Badger themed mask. That's...
Let me come on over and start the talk. All right. So talk today is going to be centered around two related bodies of work that have been going on at the Urban Institute for about the past 5 years. The first is related to the U.S. Partnership on Mobility from Poverty, which concluded about 2 years ago. And the second is a follow-on project called Boosting Upward Mobility, Metrics to Inform Local Action. So let me give you a little bit of background on the projects. So about 5 years ago, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation became very interested in domestic poverty. Noting that poverty hasn't really changed much on the last several decades in the U.S. They wanted to launch a concerted public learning effort to develop ideas on what would it take, what could we do if we really wanted to substantially increase mobility from poverty. And so with a grant to the Urban Institute stood up this partnership on mobility from poverty. We pulled together a group of about 25 leading academics and practitioners across disciplines: economics, sociology, psychology, people who worked with low-income families, people who ran community colleges, brought these scholars and practitioners together, and then went out into the field, into communities across the country, from Bedford-Stuyvesant in Brooklyn to rural poverty in the Mississippi Delta, to Native American communities like the Lummi Nation, to San Jose, where you have some extreme poverty in the midst of one of the most vibrant growing areas in the country. And the charge was to generate ideas, not to form a consensus, but to what we could do to increase mobility from poverty dramatically. One of the key insights that sort of overlaid all the work is that poverty is more than just about money. It's about power and autonomy, and it's about dignity. It's about being valued in society. And so the definition we've adopted and have carried through is that if you want to see mobility, you really need to move on 3 different dimensions: economic success, power and autonomy, and being valued in community. And if you only have movement in one of those areas without movement in the other areas, your success is going to be undermined, limited, and potentially short-lived. So if you think about it, economic success is usually what we think about when we're talking about mobility. If you move someone over, $1 above the poverty line, $100 above the poverty line, you really haven't done that much, especially if people don't feel they have more control over their lives, control of how work is done, control of where they live. You haven't really accomplished much if they don't feel they're a valued member of society, if they don't have dignity. That doesn't mean money isn't important. If you have a program or an effort where you give people more confidence or more sense of control, but that doesn't translate into greater dignity and greater economic success, that's going to be short-lived. If you have community investment, community building programs, more community engagement, you can build social capital, that's terrific. But if that increased community level capital doesn't lead to more control over what goes on in the community, if that doesn't lead to growing opportunity, you're not going to be making that much progress. So if you really want to see sustained mobility from poverty, you need to make progress on all three dimensions. And if you want to make progress on all three dimensions, and you want to see what you're doing, you really have to measure it. And so that's going to be the bulk of my talk today. So much for the peroration of the talk. The rest of the talk is going to have two parts. First, I'm going to look at economic mobility, and just to show some numbers, data, and graphs on how much mobility there is in the US. And then I'm going to talk about the work we've done at Urban and with our partners on ways to measure individual mobility from poverty and ways to metrics that we can use to track mobility from poverty at the local level. So when we're talking about mobility, there are a whole bunch of different concepts for mobility. One is relative mobility within a generation, within a cohort of people. So these next few charts are drawing data from the PSID. Basically, we're asking, taking people 25 to 34 years old, and we're ranking them into income quintiles. And then we're asking for folks who are in the bottom quintile among their peers when they're 25 to 34, 10 years later, where are they? Are they still in the bottom quintile, or have they started shuffling around? And we looked at two separate cohorts. And as you can see, if you start at the bottom, you're likely to stay at or near the bottom. Half the folks who are in the bottom quintile among their peers 10 years later are still in the bottom quintile. About 75% are in the bottom two quintiles. Now, relative mobility, how you're doing compared to your peers is important, but if your income is growing, if your earnings are growing, even if your peers are growing just as much and you're still relatively at the bottom, you still may be much better off. So some folks prefer or consider also important to look at absolute mobility. Here what we did is we looked at the income cutoffs for each quintile when people were 25 to 34. Just adjusted them for inflation and asked, did your income grow such that you were lifted above those lines? And so for folks who started in the bottom quintile, you can see the story isn't much different. A little more mobility by this measure, but basically about half the folks who are in the bottom quintile 10 years ago still have incomes that would leave them in that bottom quintile 10 years later. So that's people. Often when we talk about mobility, we care about intergenerational mobility. How do kids do relative to their parents? How do kids do relative to each other? So here we looked at children who were in the bottom income quintile, or the income quintile of children, when they were young, when they were growing up, compared to the income quintile they're in as adults. I want to focus on the lower left and the upper right of these bar graphs. For kids who were in the bottom quintile when they were children, 37% are in the bottom quintile as adults. 2/3 who are in the bottom quintile as children are in the bottom two quintiles as adults. It's pretty sticky on the bottom. Conversely, up at the top, 40% of kids who were born in the top quintile, spent their childhoods in the early childhoods in the top quintile, are in the top quintile as adults. 2/3 of those who are in the top quintile as adults, those the two yellow shades there, those kids are, in the top two quintiles as adults. So where you're born, the family you're born into, is really predictive of where you're going to get up, where you're going to end up as an adult. Now, the story of mobility for children really differs by race and ethnicity. And this is PSID. So again, we have just two races here. We have Black people and non-Black people, white people. The experience of mobility is very different. So for a Black child who is in the bottom quintile as a child, 64%, so about 2/3, are going to be in the bottom quintile as an adult. For whites, white children, the experience is very different. Only 26% of white children from the bottom quintile are in the bottom quintile as adults. So I don't have an answer to that. I think it's important to point out that, the education structures, the economic structures, the social structures that allow for and promote mobility work very differently for Black people than white people, and that really requires awareness as you're thinking about promoting mobility from poverty and more understanding. So that's a little aside on that point. The other thing is, how do kids do relative to their parents? The American dream is kids will grow up to be better off than their parents. And in the early post-war years, that was largely true. This graph is borrowed or stolen from, depending on the level of attribution, I guess, from the work of Roz Chetty. And back in the post-war years, good bet that a kid would earn more than their parents. 90% would earn more. For folks born in the 80s and later, it's down to a 50-50 proposition. So in the US context, focusing on economic success, mobility doesn't look all that great. How does the US compare to other countries? Well, here we're comparing the correlation between a father's earnings and a son's earnings, and you can see that the US and the UK have substantially less mobility than other developed countries. So that's the context in which we are beginning our work. This limited economic mobility may reflect inattention to the other important aspects of mobility: power and autonomy, the sense of control over one's life, the ability to control one's life, and the sense of dignity of being socially included, of being valued in your community. And again, we believe that we can measure all three dimensions. And I'm going to talk about a paper that came out of the partnership that provides measures of mobility for all three aspects of mobility at the individual level. And then we translate that work into local level metrics for our next body of work. So individual level metrics, I'm going to draw on work from this paper on measuring mobility from poverty that I and colleagues at Urban, along with members of the partnership and along with a group of scholars at Stanford, put together. And here's a clear example of lexicographic privilege with my name coming first for only the reason that it starts with an A. In addition to the paper, one of the products that came out, which I think is particularly useful, is an online toolkit for measuring mobility from poverty that provides vetted measures for all three aspects of mobility from poverty that researchers and practitioners can use. So what we hope people will do with this is, if you're trying to, evaluate a training program and you want to know why one side's doing better than the other or why gains were short-lived, you're probably measuring employment, you're probably measuring earnings, but are you measuring whether people have a sense of control over their lives? Are you measuring whether they feel valued or they feel their work is valued? Probably not. You can measure it and it might explain some of the variation you see. Similarly, if you're engaged, looking at a population trying to look at something like family resilience in the wake of COVID, it's important not just to focus on economic measures, but also on these other aspects, inclusion and autonomy, that are which ultimately all play a part in mobility. So I will you'll get the URL for this toolkit. And if you see the face page, then you can select the measures that you're interested in. And you can see that there are a bunch of measures for power and autonomy, a bunch of measures for being valued in community, a bunch of measures for economic success. I will blow this up. You'll see it. You don't have to squint. You can also select the type of population you want to focus on. Are you most interested in kids, teens, or adults? You can also adjust the reading level if you're worried about the level of literacy in the populations you're surveying. And also, because questions take time, you can select questions based on how long the battery of questions it takes to answer. So What are the aspects of economic success we want to capture? Well, pretty standard. We want to know about how much money you earn, how much income you have total, what are the sources of that income, what's your wealth, what's your asset and debt position is. We want to know about your human capital. We also want to know about your job. Does your job have non-wage benefits? Does your job have flexible scheduling or rigid scheduling or intermittent scheduling? All these things play into economic success. And of course, we also want to have a measure of economic hardship. Most people are familiar with these measures. Power and autonomy. How do you capture that? Well, the psychologists on our team have a battery of measures that they have used that are vetted that link to economic mobility, and they address things like, the sense of control you have over your life, whether you believe your actions, whether your actions lead to positive results, and so there are a set of measures that we recommend here. And for being valued in the community, we look at things that speak to dignity and belongingness. Things like, do you feel you fit in your community? Are you lonely? Collective efficacy. Have you had adverse experiences or traumatic experiences? So just to give you an example of how some of these measures work, in the power and autonomy section, we look at the kind of person scale, which is a standard 6-point scale where we see how much you agree or disagree with statements like, everyone, no matter who they are, can significantly change their basic characteristics. Some of these questions are flip-coded. Generally, the scale is the higher the score, the greater the growth mindset, the greater your belief that your efforts can cause things to improve. And research shows that folks with higher scores on the kind of person scale are more likely to move out of poverty. If you were to select this measure from the toolkit, you would come to a screen like this that provides a definition of what the scale is. It provides information on the research validating the scale, who the scale is most appropriate for, and then you can actually download the specific questions used for the scale. That being valued in community, the social inclusion aspect of mobility from poverty. An example is the UCLA loneliness scale. Again, it's a 4-point scale from never to always. And you're answering questions like, how often do you feel left out? Some of the questions are flip-coded, but ultimately higher scores are associated with higher levels of loneliness. And research shows that folks who are lonelier have other challenges related to social mobility that links to mobility from poverty. Again, going to the website and looking at the variable, you get information on what the scale is, how it's used, information on the validity of the scale, and you can you can pull down the questions and include them in your work. So what we hope the greater research and practitioner community can do is, when they are trying to understand programs and practices that should influence or could influence mobility from poverty, they take the broader definition, not just focus on economic success, but also consider power and autonomy and social inclusion, and that they make use of this these type of questions. It can be measured, and there can be tremendous insight gained in understanding how these other factors are interrelate to mobility from poverty. So that's at the individual level. And next, I will move to our next body of work that focused on metrics for local action. But before I keep talking, I'm going to have a sip of coffee. All right, so after we completed that work, the Gates Foundation came back and said, well, this is lovely. We know from the work of Raj Chetty that where you grow up really matters, and that some people grow up in communities that are launchpad communities. People grow up there and they are highly mobile. Other people do not. What are the aspects of communities that can explain mobility? Can we measure it? Can communities use these metrics to track mobility and to track conditions that are conducive to mobility? And so that is this next project. Under this project, we also gathered a multidisciplinary group of scholars and engaged with community groups to identify a set of community level metrics that together are linked, again, to all three aspects of poverty, mobility from poverty. That work is summarized in this report. Again, I will send you a link. And so essentially, the framework that we developed was that to boost upward mobility, to hit all three dimensions, economic success, being valued in community, and power and autonomy, there were three main drivers. You needed strong and healthy families, you needed supportive communities, and those communities needed to provide opportunities to earn and learn. So let me talk about each of those three drivers. Strong and healthy families is basically, people live and grow up in families, and a secure and stable home environment is the foundation for children to develop in a healthy fashion. It's the place where they go out into school. It's the place where they go out into the world. And so that is the foundation for their future economic success. And it is also where they feel valued in their small community, and the achievements and accomplishments they have also give them a sense of power and control. So strong and healthy families is an important driver. Supportive communities, this is where people live. They have to feel safe in those communities. That's where their social networks form, where they feel supported, where they can manage a crisis, where they can learn about job opportunities. So communities really are the environment in which people live. It's where children grow up. It's where they thrive and succeed. And finally, opportunities to earn and learn. People build human capital from pre-K through high school, community college training, whatever. So you need to have the opportunities to build the human capital, to get jobs, and jobs are the primary source for economic and social mobility and economic security. So at the community level, we want to see that all three drivers are in place and strong so that these communities are launchpad neighborhoods. Now, drivers are really broad. We need to narrow that down. And so we go from drivers to what we call predictors. So for each driver, we identify things that predict mobility from poverty. And we engaged with our experts and with community members and went to the literature and considered over 80 predictors. Our goal was, if communities are going to use metrics to measure mobility of poverty, we have to have a finite number. We were hoping to have 10 to 12. That proved impossible given the nature of the mission, touching on all three dimensions of mobility. We actually winnowed the list down to about 25. Once we had the 25 predictors, we needed to find ways to measure them. And so we developed criteria to pick the specific metrics associated with each predictor. And the key criteria we landed on was they had to be a valid measure of the predictor. They're correlated with what we are trying to get at and a good measure of it. We wanted those metrics to be repeated at regular intervals. We wanted them to be available for places across the country, all counties, all large cities. We wanted them to be consistently collected and calculated, so no major shift in the definition of the metric over time. We wanted them to be available for key population subgroups, particularly different race and ethnic groups, because as we've seen, the process of mobility is very different depending on your race and ethnicity. And we didn't want them to be particularly sensitive to residential mobility. So for example, poverty in a county can go down not because the incomes of poor folk go up, but because poor folk move out or rich people move in. Most of the metrics we found could not meet all these criteria. The most important criteria we had is valid. I think they all hit that valid criteria. And then there were trade-offs between the importance of the predictor in terms of being linked to mobility and how frequently it was collected, how it was collected, and whether it's sensitive or not. So all of our metrics come with a set of limitations, and that we feel that we are now sort of at a beta place with it. We're trying to learn more about the metrics and improve the set of metrics we have. So I don't think it would be particularly enthralling to talk in depth about 25 different metrics, but let me just go over the metrics that we do have. So under strong and healthy families, we wanted to capture the idea of financial well-being, and we do that with a predictor of income and a predictor of financial security. Income is a pretty standard measure. We're looking at household income at the 20th, 50th, and 80th percentiles within the community. And that is something that's pretty widely available, for example, from the American Community Survey. Financial security, we started out wanting to measure wealth, but that's very hard to measure and certainly hard to get consistent measures for all counties or cities. What we ended up with was the share of households with debt in collections, which we can get from credit bureau data, which we do have. And that's sort of an extreme measure of hardship, where not only do you have negative net worth, you have debt, but you can't pay it back. But that is sort of a canary in a coal mine type of metric for a county or a local jurisdiction where many households have debt in collections. You know that that is probably a problem for mobility, something you want to address. For housing, we wanted to get affordable housing, which is basically the ratio of affordable and available units relative to the households with low and very low incomes. Housing and civilian homelessness, we're using child homelessness as the metric for that. Oops. Family stability, we're looking at living arrangements for children as opposed to necessarily the stability of the arrangements, because at least in the US context, married two-parent families tend to be more stable than others, but again, there are other aspects of family structure and family dynamics that are important. This was probably our most controversial metric, I think. Overall health, it's a self-rated measure for children and adults in good or excellent health. That is a metric, for example, that falls down on the criteria of widely available. Essentially, that's a metric where we suggest a local data gathering effort would be appropriate. Access to health services, we're using an indicator of whether there's a health professional shortage in the county you live in. Neonatal health, we're looking at the share of children born at low birth weight, because children born at low birth weight are at elevated risk for developmental challenges. Our next driver was supportive communities. Here we're getting at things with collective efficacy and power, including political participation, what share of the eligible population actually turns out to vote, descriptive representation, which is basically asks, are the elected officials in your community demographically reflective of the people in your community? Safety, another important domain. We want to see if children were exposed to trauma. We want to look at the crime rate, if people are being exposed to crime. And we also know that how social order is enforced can affect how people do. So we want to keep an eye on overly punitive policing, and we're doing that by looking at the rate of juvenile arrests. Neighborhoods, we're looking at economic inclusion. Are the poor concentrated in certain neighborhoods? We're looking at racial diversity, which is basically a neighborhood exposure index. Belongingness, we're using the inclusion of other in self metric, which if you had a keen eye, you saw was an individual level metric. That is another measure that falls down on the widely available. This is a metric that we think local communities are going to have to collect for themselves. Similarly, social capital, we're suggesting selected questions from the Social Capital Community Benchmark Survey, focusing more on bridging capital than binding capital. Access to transportation is another metric, as is environmental quality, where we're using EPA information on air quality. Our last set of drivers are opportunities to earn and learn. And so starting with the youngest kids, we want to look at access to preschool. Access is tough to measure, so instead we're looking at enrollment of 3- and 4-year-olds in nursery school or preschool. The effectiveness of public education, or where we're looking at the per grade change in English language achievement between 3rd and 8th grades in the community. Student poverty concentration, students who go to schools with high numbers of low-income kids tend to not do as well. And so we have a measure of that. For college readiness, we really struggled to get that. And our measure we are using are the share of 19 and 20-year-olds who have a high school degree. Just because you have a high school degree doesn't mean you are ready for college, but it is sort of a de minimis precursor. Work. For employment, we just focused on the share of 25 to 54-year-olds who are working, the employment to population ratio, and then for access to paying jobs paying a living wage, we took wage information from the quarterly census of employment and wages to get wages, and to get the cost of living, we went to MIT's living wage calculator, and we're showing the ratio of the two. So these are the metrics that we suggest communities use if they're interested in looking at, have they created conditions that are beneficial to mobility from poverty across all 3 aspects. We hope that communities use them to compare where they are on metrics to their peer communities. For the metrics that look low, they can choose to prioritize actions that will help create conditions and for mobility and improve mobility, to see the interconnection between all these metrics, and to monitor their progress. And this is more than just an aspirational goal. The Gates Foundation has, working with Urban, has put out a request for proposal for communities that want to use these metrics to help design changes, programs, practices to make their communities more conducive to mobility, to see more mobility for their residents. So the RFPs have gone out, and we have received 64 applications from counties across the country. And we're in the process of whittling those letters of interest down to 25 counties that will be asked to submit full proposals. 8 will be selected, and we will then be able to test out how these metrics can be used to develop a strategy for improving mobility at the community level, see if there are better metrics or what metrics we need to change, and see if they actually lead to results. So it is a learning process, and we're very excited about going forward with it. Now, last thing, I'm going to switch screens for a second. I'm going to switch screens one more time. Sorry for, I appreciate your patience here. We have at Urban collected at the county level most of these metrics, the ones that don't require original data collection, for all counties in the US for the most recent year available. And that data set is going to be available to researchers and scholars who may want to use it. We are in the process of adding breakdowns by race, ethnicity, and other categories to metrics where that's warranted and possible, and also filling in more historical data. So, for example, the way the data would display, always have to have the Urban logo, yay for marketing, for Arlington, Virginia, which is picked because I'm sitting here in Arlington, Virginia right now. And there will be information available for the county and comparison counties. And so you will be able to see the income data. This is household income. We have an assessment of data quality, the source of the data. This comes from the American Community Survey, and notes explaining how the data are used. So household income, we talked about financial security, just scrolling on down to something like transportation access, where this measures the average percentile rank of ability for public transportation use at the county level. Crime rates, violent crime per 100,000 people, and it comes from the University Uniform Crime Statistics. So these data are available to you now, and I think I have stopped sharing the screen. So the key takeaways here, I think, are that mobility from poverty is about more than just money, and that's really, when you want to measure mobility from poverty, you've got to consider economic success, in addition, power and autonomy. Do people have more control over their lives? And dignity, belonging. Do they feel valued in their community? A lot of concepts there, but we can and should measure all these aspects, both at the individual and the community level. And that right now, we still feel that we're in a learning process, that we have a set of tools and metrics. We want to know, do they work? Do they enhance our understanding? And also, how can we improve them? And either you've asked questions and I haven't seen them, or you've been checking email. I don't know, but thank you so much for your time. And then I will send links to all the resources that are publicly available.
Great. And Greg, this is Catherine. Apologies
Hi, Catherine.
for having missed the first few minutes. I got almost all of your talk. Fortunately, just the introduction I missed. Sorry about that. So what we do now is take questions from the audience. So I want to invite folks to type into the chat message or raise your hand and I can unmute you. I see Liz has a question. Go ahead, Liz.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I'm just wondering if, in thinking about selecting the 8 communities that are going to sort of receive this technical assistance, or however you're describing it, has a decision been made about how those will be selected, in terms of, I can think about if they were all fairly similar communities, that would allow for some more powerful observations of differences across the community. So a similar size, for example. And so that could be an advantage of choosing 8 similar size communities. In contrast, you could also definitely choose very, very different communities, and that would have the benefits of, doing this deeper analysis on counties of different sizes. So can you just talk a little bit about what the intention is there, and if there's intention to do more of this type of work in the future?
So again, this is the beginning of our learning process in working with counties to use these metrics to develop their strategies. The main criteria we are looking at is, do the county have a clear commitment to trying to make this work? And do they have the capacity to use and work with data? We also want to make sure that we have different types of counties. So we want to have some, some more urban counties, some ex-urban counties, and in some cases a consortium of counties that are more rural, to see how different places are working with it. We also are hoping to get some geographic variety. We don't want them all to be in Ohio, for example. So with 8, I don't think we can sort of have a bunch of similar places or a bunch of different places. I think we're looking at this more as, what can we learn? What works? For whom? Is there? We won't know, definitively even at the end of the process whether the reason it worked in large county and not small county was because of the size of the county versus some other aspect, idiosyncratic aspect. We just want to see what is working, how are people using it, are the metrics useful, would other metrics be useful? So it's a learning process.
Thanks. Peter, you have a question? Let me just enable your...
All right.
Yeah.
Looks like I'm unmuted. Okay, great. So I just had a question about kind of the bigger picture of utilizing these metrics. So I'm a UW-Madison master's student, and so I'm taking a class on program evaluation, which is like quantitative. And I'm also taking a class on like critical theory, which talks a lot about these kind of power and access issues. And it kind of seems like utilizing and propagating these metrics is an attempt to kind of bridge the gap between the two subjects in a way and try to capture some of those power and access issues with metrics. So I'm just curious, like, do you think this was like, this is kind of an issue that's been under scrutinized in traditional quantitative evaluation in those spaces? And like, how do you see these metrics as kind of shifting that conversation a little bit?
So it is very explicitly a desire to broaden the conversation and broaden the factors that are considered, and to bridge the gap in research. Our hope is by showing that there are ways to measure what economists may think of as more squishy aspects, that there are ways to measure them, and that if you take them into account, it might explain some of the variation or some of the differences or some of the lack of success you see when trying to understand poverty or programs to alleviate poverty or increase mobility. Because again, it's not that any of these aspects are subordinate to the other aspects. They're all important, and to have sustained mobility, we feel the hypothesis is that you need to attend to all 3 dimensions. So for example, you can increase income to low-income families in a couple of different ways. You can have a cash transfer program that's highly bureaucratic, where you have to demonstrate need and recertify a lot, and people assume you're cheating, and that really is going to not do very well on the power and autonomy scale. Or you can have a cash assistance program like universal basic income that just provides money, or a program like the earned income tax credit, where the money you transfer you get is somewhat earned, and some may provide more sustained gains. So what we are thinking, or what we're hoping, is that as people investigate programs, practices, and mobility from poverty, programs targeted at low-income families, that they consider the power and the dignity aspects of it as well. These things can be measured, and if you measure them, we might gain new insights. So, you know, it is something that we're trying to incorporate in our work at Urban, and certainly we'd love to see other people start incorporating it.
Thanks. Hillary, you had a question?
Yeah, building on what you were just talking about, what do we know about, can you say a little more about what we know regarding interventions that could move the needle on some of the non-financial aspects, so the power and autonomy aspects and the social inclusion? It sounds like you were talking about some structural design, you know, kinds of aspects, but, you know, are there like independent interventions, or are we talking about building new components and new structures into existing programs that build financial mobility?
So I was really talking at the 30,000 foot level. So descending down to, say 20,000 feet here. You know, there are programs, for example, like the Empath program that one of our mobility partners, Elizabeth Babcock, runs, where their approach to working with low-income folks is a coaching model as opposed to a caseworker model in practice, where the goal is to really increase empowerment on the individuals, to help them articulate what they feel they need and help them develop a strategy and a program for achieving, for meeting their goals and their needs, and then holding, you know, and then using that to track their progress and channel extra supports. So, you know, that is an example of a program that focuses on power and autonomy, that where you have more power and control in your life and working on developing that coaching does seem to lead to more sustained economic success, along with the increased power and autonomy. So that is just an example. And I don't know how close I've come to answering your question.
But fine, yeah, thanks. It's a good start.
I see Jeff is patiently waiting with his hand raised, like a good economist. Go for it, Jeff.
That'd be a good title for a novel, The Good Economist. So this is a little bit related to Hillary's question and to Peter's question, I guess. One way to think about proceeding would be to take to county officials some broader version of a What-Worth Clearinghouse for Poverty that included the squishy treatments for the squishy outcomes as well as the unsquishy outcomes. And that would kind of presume that they knew the problem but needed help figuring out how to address it. The approach that's kind of outlined here is sort of the reverse, which is you bring to them all these statistics that give them much more nuance about the problem than they may have had before. But kind of implicit in it is that then they know what to do if you tell them what the problem is. And I just thought that was a very interesting juxtaposition, and I was wondering if you would comment on it.
So, you know, not to sound too much like a federalist, but we do sort of believe that that, you know, folks on the ground, folks at the, you know, at the local level, know their populations, know their community resources, know what is politically feasible, and know the language that needs to be used at the local level. And so if at the local level there is a concern about community members who are not thriving, if the community as a whole is not thriving, if it's economically stagnant, and there's a desire to improve conditions, then here what we are providing is a set of tools. You can see what's working relatively for you as compared to comparison communities, and you can track changes over time. And then we can provide extra technical assistance to say, well, if you want to move, if you want to reduce, say, overly aggressive policing, there are some things you can try. We would draw on a whole other set of literature and experts for that. But that's part of the technical assistance we will be providing to the eight selected communities. So, I think that, if someone doesn't see a problem, they're not going to want to use metrics. It's only if they perceive a problem that they'll want to use the metrics to understand the dimensions and the nuance of it. And then that can help facilitate the conversation towards solutions. And one of the key things we feel on the solutions side is don't just, do worry about economic development and human capital development, but that's not enough. And you'll have more success if you're mindful of the need for people to have power and control over their lives and dignity, the sense that, it's not someone's doing something for me, it's something that I'm doing, and my peers, my labor, my larger community also values it. So keep those things in mind as you're working towards solutions.
There's a sense here in which there is a model of poverty that is implicit in the set of metrics that you have chosen to present the communities with, which I think is also interesting.
So, could you say a little more about that? Because I'm sort of swimming in it, and so I'd appreciate hearing your perspective a bit more.
It seems to me that the typical public official is going to need both, I guess. Mm-hmm. That they may not, they're going to have a big picture view of, whoa, this part of my county is doing well, this part is doing badly, but they're not going to have the kind of nuance in general that the set of metrics that this project produces are going to provide. Mm-hmm. At the same time, my sense is that most people who run counties haven't taken that program evaluation class that Peter's taking, mm-hmm. and have a hard time. I think often, over at the Department of Education, they fret a lot about the fact that actual folks on the ground in schools don't use the What Works Clearinghouse as much as they would like. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how much is known about why that is, but I would guess that part of it is that people who run schools think they know more than they know. And I worry about that in this domain as well. And so that's why I guess, partly it's just a very different approach than I think we normally undertake. And I like that. It's good to try different things.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And there's a question I wanted to bring up, since I don't see any other hands.
I'm waiting patiently, Jeff, but I won't interrupt.
You don't have your hand up.
Okay, hold on. I literally, to my point, I literally can't because I'm the host. They don't allow me.
That's all right. All right.
But finish off.
All right. No, I was just. Do you have any? Are you going to try to evaluate this initiative in a formal way? I know you're only doing 8 counties. This is also kind of brought up in a previous question, I think, too. Are you going to pick 16 counties that you would like to serve, stratify them, and then randomize? You could do that.
Well, that's interesting. So we are, we're in the, we're just about to, tell the 25 counties that are finalists. So given that we are selecting the counties that we think are largely best suited and present the best case for being able to work with and use these metrics, picking 8 counties that we didn't think were as strong as a comparison group seems somewhat problematic. But if we do find that out of the 25, 12 look really good or 13 look really good, theoretically we could do follow-ups with the counties that we end up not picking based on how far the application fell down the stairs and for our final selection process. I really wish I didn't say that. Of course we're not going to do that, but there are if I think we have not talked about following counties we don't select or doing follow-ups with them, and that's a really interesting idea. So Thank you for that.
And I guess I have I won't say a handful of questions, but it's probably more than one question in my question. So it strikes me that there have been slightly different, but not entirely different efforts. So I'm thinking of the county health rankings, which actually are much broader than physical health, right? And get into the economic issues. And so to some extent, right, if we think that these metrics and information have been available to some counties, I guess I'm curious how much is, and to Jeff's question, right, there's this question of technical assistance about how do you work on these issues. But I think there's really, and I understand why thinking about a county makes sense, because you think maybe that's the right geographic unit, right? That's when you know what's happening and you have a sense of what to do, perhaps. But I worry a lot about counties not having enough resources and not literally being in charge of their purse strings, right? Like they may get allocations from states for human services, but they themselves don't have quite the same tax, it depends on what state you're in, obviously, but, there's lots of limits on what municipalities can do to bring in their own revenue. And so I'm worried a lot about providing information and technical assistance without also guaranteeing that there are resources. And I'm just curious what the thinking is behind, it almost seems to me like a lot of, and I'm overstating this, but wishful thinking that if we just provide information and support, technical support, the resources will appear, when that's often, and then we'll say, well, the information and technical support didn't do enough. I don't know. I'm struggling with that. So I'm curious if they have access to more of Gates money to actually implement things as well.
So one of the things we struggled with was what was the right jurisdictional level to focus on, because we did not want to take a jurisdictional level where there was not enough control over the resources. And we didn't want to be too small. We didn't want to go too large. We didn't want to go at the state level because things are too diverse. So we settled on county, knowing that in different states, counties have different levels of power. So for example, in New England, counties aren't a real important source of governance. But what we did encourage in New England was for counties to partner together for their application, and we'd work with a group of counties where that is the municipal planning unit. So we know that there are counties for whom this just won't work, that they don't have the resources to use metrics efficiently. They don't have the resources to act on policies and programs. We thought we'd have a better reach and get a more diverse set of places with counties than with cities, because it's really just the largest cities, although some places the city would have been the right unit. We went back and forth on that. Along with the technical assistance, there's a small amount of money from the Gates Foundation which is really planning support to the communities more than active support. One of the criteria we are evaluating on is like, can you actually make changes in response to the metrics, implement a program? Counties who really can't do it because they lack the expertise, they lack the finances, won't make the cut. If we find counties that can use the metrics, want to use the metrics, and have the resources and the willingness to act on the metrics, and we see what they do and we see that they make progress, then we can start tailoring it to other geographies that align with, local control and decision making in those places where county isn't the right level. So more than one question, more than one answer? Did that?
Yeah, it does. I think there's a piece of it that feels like wishful thinking that with better data, they'll be able to deploy existing resources in a more efficient way. And I think a little bit of that is maybe not realistic, but we'll find out. There's one more question. Rebecca Schwei asks, What have you learned from communities who have administered well-being indices? For example, the city of Santa Monica, that had a, this is not the right word, a robust, I'm hoping is what she meant to write, well-being project that I think is no longer operating. What she wrote is a pro-gust well-being project. I'm pretty sure pro-gust is not a word. So it's either productive or robust. I don't know what she meant.
So we have not looked at Santa Monica explicitly. We have looked at sort of other metrics efforts. You know, the one that we keep, you know, the one that really rings the bell is Charlotte-Mecklenburg, that had, you know, atrocious mobility scores from in the Chetty data that really went back and said, what can we do to improve the schools? How can we improve mobility? You know, we've had community forums where we've listened to people like, what do we need to measure? How do we need to measure it? Why haven't we included X, Y, and Z? And I can't draw a direct line to what those communities are, because there are people in the room from different communities and the specific efforts. So I'm going to give this answer a C-, but maybe that's generous, but I think there is more to learn from communities that have tried to use metrics. This is a large project at Urban, and they put me in the corner with the data more of the time than let me talk to people. So I'll use that as my defense on that one.
That's fine. Does anyone have another question? I think we're, oh, wait, hold on. Kurt, let me unmute you. Kurt, you're allowed to talk now.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, so feel free to ignore this question if it's too far afield. I'm intrigued by the idea of incorporating larger than income and those type of metrics in mobility. But I'm wondering how the team thinks about the endogeneity of internal psychological states of affairs and external objective socioeconomic and political factors, right? If one of the ways to think about poverty is internalized oppression, then why should we care about internal states of affairs, about sense of efficacy or loneliness? Aren't those in fact a result of poverty, not necessarily a cause?
So we think all these dimensions are interrelated. So, you know, income poverty is both a cause and a consequence of a lack of autonomy, a lack of dignity, and, you know, a lack of self-efficacy contributes to a lack of income as well. So it's all endogenous. If the goal is, so what we're trying to do is recognize the interdependence and interconnectedness of these three aspects, and note that if you want to see progress in any one of those areas, you're going to need to be attentive to the other two. So as a practical matter, how you design a training program, how you design an income support program, how do you handle casework or coaching, how do you handle community empowerment, community decisions, you need to be mindful of all three aspects, because just as you can have a vicious cycle, one thing undermines the other, you can also have a virtuous cycle. You make a little progress here, that might give you a little progress here, but you're going to need to do more on all three fronts to get to a sustained higher level. So from an implementation perspective, I think the goal is to be mindful of the three dimensions. From a research perspective, keep track of the others understanding the causal links in a formal evaluation is an econometric challenge that, fortunately we have folks like Jeff to help with.
Can Greg, and I apologize because I did miss the first few minutes of your talk, and maybe this was in that piece that I missed. I want to believe that those three pieces moving together would make a more sustained and stronger impact. What evidence do you point to as proving that? Other than the empath, which I'm aware of, but is a small new program.
Small. I think that I view this more as a hypothesis or a theory than a proven claim.
Okay. Yeah.
I think it is really, I find it very appealing. Compelling, but it's really something that we want to test.
Right.
And so we now have a set of tools that we've tried to make more readily available. We're working at the community level. We'd love to see if it works.
Yeah.
And
that makes sense.
That's where we are with it.
Yeah. I appreciate that. We have one more question. We're full of dialogue today. Angie writes, for areas not at capacity to fully implement this project, are there certain aspects, sections that would be recommended to build capacity? And Angie, I'm happy to unmute you right now in case you want to add more. I'm not sure I understand your question. Angie?
Hi, can you hear me?
I can hear you. We can hear you.
Oh, great. So we're actually working with, or we were participated with Empath on incorporating coaching into our TANF program here in South Dakota. So one of the things that we were looking at is, how are we measuring the mobility or the success of our customers? And so I'm intrigued with some of the aspects that you had talked about earlier. And like Catherine, I came in a little bit late, so maybe you had covered it earlier, and I apologize for that. But, that's one of the things. We're not at a capacity where we don't have the data pieces together. We're implementing it in selected counties. And so it would be great to incorporate some of those question assessments or whatever into it to help us measure the success of the coaching approach.
So I think at the, in the South Dakota counties that you're working, you have a sense of the needs of the population and the dynamics of the population. If, for example, you would go to the online toolkit, you could select specific metrics that seem to be best suited to the population you're working with and the goals you're trying to achieve. So, wouldn't suggest taking, all 12 questions on being valued in community, because it would take several hours to get through all of them. But you could select one or two that are at the appropriate level for the appropriate population, that speak to the proper relationships, and do that as an intake survey and a follow-up survey, for example. Not which ones would be most appropriate, I couldn't tell you now, but I think that there's enough information on the toolkit and in the paper to help you sort through, what questions are most appropriate for what population subgroups and what are the correlations we see in the research. So I hope it's, part of this is advertising a tool, which we hope is useful, and this is a case where it might be useful, and I'd be happy to, talk with you more about it offline at some point.
Okay, thank you. We are right at 1:30. So Greg, I want to thank you for taking all this time to talk with us about this exciting project. We're going to look forward to having you back and hear about the lessons learned when you're along.
And maybe I can actually do that come out to Madison for it.
Imagine that.
In the chat, I do see that Karina Momartz is drinking from her Urban Institute mug. And so I want to send a shout out to her. We do miss her. at Urban, and I can certainly find an office for her, especially now that we're not in the building, but no, our new building.
Well, I'm sure she'll look forward to visiting with you when you can get out here. So thank you again so much for your time and for sharing this really interesting and important work with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Take care. Bye.